Good morning, everyone. And I'm just going to start by saying I always appreciate having an introduction so the audience knows a little bit more of who I am. But I'm just Kelly. And I'm just excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about the work that we do at the University of Minnesota and the work that we do across the USED network in the United States. And so today, when I had the opportunity to visit with Sarah and Sue and Alan and talk about, what are the kinds of things that would be interesting and exciting to talk about on World Usability Day? What are the kinds of things that are most relevant to sort of a cross-section of the University of Maine's faculty, staff, community members? And so I hope I'm going to hit that on the target today, because what we're going to talk about, or what I'm going to spend a little time, is talking about having raised expectations around education and employment for people with disabilities. And that sounds like a really simple equation, like, yes, that makes sense, but there's a lot more to it. So we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so going through some things to talk about how that works or doesn't work on college campuses and in the community. And I hope to give you a little bit more context with some data, a little bit more context with some stories, and a little bit more context with some videos. So I want to make sure to thank our captioner who's joining us here today. You're going to get a little bit of cutoff on the screen. And I'm also going to go back and forth with a couple of videos later on just to make sure that we get all of the captioning in. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me. So it actually says on the top up there, it's covered up, it says, "Hi, I'm Kelly." And a lot of times when we talk, or if you go to events and listen to people speak, you sort of like, well, who are they and what are they about? Or like, what is their agenda or their story or their background? And some people choose to share this. I choose to be pretty transparent about sort of who I am, where I come from, and the lens from which I sort of see and view the world. That may resonate very well with the way that you see the world, or it may not. My hope is to connect with people on some universal principles about people today, but knowing where I came from kind of gives you a sense of that. So I'm a social worker by training. I'm most interested, or probably spend the most amount of time in things related to employment, transition, person-centered practices. But my foundation really comes from working as a direct support professional in the field, in the industry. So long before you went to school, or, I worked in group homes, lots of different kinds of group homes, and day services as well. So I've worked in a couple of different roles. But for me, the motto that I try to live by in sort of whatever circumstance or hat or environment I am in, and this comes from my mom, is because nice matters. So being nice, being civil, and sharing those experiences and trying to connect with people is really important to me. So if you have questions along the way, or have questions at the end, or want to visit more, I am happy to connect with you. So for today's session, usually like if you go to a formal program, like at a conference or an event, you have your learning objectives for the day of these are the things I'm going to talk about. And I try to keep it much more simple in the sense that, like, when you leave today, I hope you feel motivated. I hope there's something that you can take and put in your pocket and share with your colleagues or a family member or somebody that you know, and that you feel like you learned something today, that when you left the house, you were here, and at the end of the session today, you're over here. And those are really, in the simplest way, what I hope to accomplish today, because what we're going to talk about are some of these typical trajectories that we see, these sort of equations of how humans and people behave and experiences, and what that looks like for people with and without disabilities. And I'm going to try to enrich that with sharing some videos of lived experiences for people with disabilities themselves. Now, depending on sort of where you sit in your community or your profession, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is focused on people with significant disabilities, and so that may or may not resonate with you or your experience, but again, that's kind of the lens that I'm coming through. I'm also hoping to give you some data to kind of give you context for the challenges that lie in front of us. Again, not as sort of like scare you away that things are terrible and bad, but more like we sort of have to understand the 30,000 foot view before we can dig in and find the spaces we can make movement. So first and foremost, there's just a couple of sort of grounding slides that I like to share and that I want to talk about, is that there really is this spectrum of disability. And according to the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, about 26% of U.S. adults live with a disability. That's about 61 million people. So although sometimes we may think of disability as a small population, it's not. It's everywhere. And disability exists on this spectrum of disabilities that may be highly visible to the naked eye, or disabilities that are completely invisible that you would never know. The reality is, when we think about inclusion and accommodation, we're talking about everybody. We're talking about all disabilities across that spectrum, from things like cerebral palsy, traumatic brain injury, mental health conditions, and all of it is important when we're thinking about inclusion and participation. And one of the things I also always want to challenge people about is that just because somebody has a visible disability is not reflective of their capabilities or contributions. And likewise, just because a disability is invisible doesn't mean that that person wouldn't benefit from an accommodation or support. And that really is kind of changing our thinking, because as humans, we see things and we respond in a certain way. And so it's really thinking about not judging a book by your cover, if you will, and that disability may be different, but it's not less than. Another thing to think about as we talk about making employment and education the new normal for everyone, or for people who choose that, is thinking about this spectrum of inclusion. That historically, the disability service system has really created an environment where people with disabilities are separate or different. We've created spaces and structures, whether it's school, transportation, housing, healthcare, just for people with disabilities. And you kind of see that at the top left there, where it says only people with disabilities. But there's really this kind of, it doesn't show it as a spectrum linearly, but circularly, of that there are all different kinds of supports and modifications. And that ultimately what we're really trying to move towards is this idea of how do we create spaces and environments, socially, emotionally, culturally, that are welcoming and accommodating to all people. Again, whether you have a visible or invisible disability, wherever you happen to occupy that space. And so this is really what we're trying to get at. And that what public money and policy is really trying to do today is fund and support places where people with disabilities are playing an active role, that they are leaders, while there may be accommodations or accommodations or modifications, that everybody can participate if they choose to. The other thing I want to remind folks as I talk about today about education in particular is that I'm sort of using education broadly as stuff that happens after high school. So that could be a 2 or a 4-year university, it could be a 9-month certificate program, it could be a technical education. So when I'm talking about education today, we're thinking about post-high school. What are the things that we can do to make education more accessible to everyone? And the definition of employment that I'm going to be working from today is employment in the regular or typical community at or above minimum wage, where coworkers or people are working with people with or without disabilities. And for those of you that maybe don't have a long history in disability services, historically many people with disabilities, particularly significant disabilities, were in day and employment services that didn't necessarily meet this criteria. And the reality is, even today, there are millions of people who are working in day and employment settings that don't meet this criteria. So this is still an issue, but today when I'm talking about having a job, we're talking about in the community, in a diverse setting, at or above minimum wage. Does that make sense? Yes, okay. So let's get started here. And I'm sorry my little equation button didn't show up, but think about this sort of equation or this typical trajectory, and we're trying to get to sort of economic well-being or success. And again, success can be things like, you know, having money, having a job, having prestige, having a title, owning a home, having a car. You can sort of insert whatever economic well-being means to a person. And really, what we have been sort of told in life and in our sort of cultural and community practices is that this is the equation for success. You go to school, you get a job, you have success. And that's very much a part of sort of the narrative that we see in our own culture, and I should say Western culture, is that they're really embedded in these messages of, like, in media, in parenting, in politics. Go to school, get a job, and you'll be successful. You'll have the American dream. But what I really challenge people, or what we're going to talk today, is that does this equation or trajectory stand to be true for people with disabilities? And if it doesn't, how do we make potentially this trajectory more of a reality? So we're going to look at a couple pieces of data today. And again, data just really gives us context for the challenges that we're sort of up against. And so this comes from the American Community Survey, which is a data set that exists with the U.S. Census Bureau. So it's something that occurs sort of in conjunction or in parallel when they do the census. And it's a different sample, but it's a representative sample of the United States. And so what we're looking at here on the left-hand side are the different levels of education that this data set looks at. And across the top, I picked three categories: people without disabilities, people with any disability, or people with cognitive disabilities, which would fall in the more significant disability category. So what you see there is folks with less than a high school diploma, an equivalent, some college or a BA or higher. And what I really want to highlight, because again, if we go back to that equation of education if we go back to that equation, these things hopefully lead to economic well-being. But what you see here is the fact that in this case, 1/5 or 1/4 of people with disabilities aren't even leaving with a high school diploma. So what does that say about their trajectory to get into college if you don't have a high school diploma? And this should be problematic and concerning to all of us, because if you think about the policy structures that we have with the Americans with Disabilities Act, with the ADA, with No Child Left Behind, with Public Law 94-142, why does that still happen? Why is it that we're still comfortable or okay, or we accept the fact that large numbers of people with disabilities actually never leave with the high school diploma? So again, going back to my previous slide here about education plus employment equal economic well-being, well, what if you're not even getting an education? Like, you're basically cut off even before you get started. The other thing to look at on this particular slide is that if you look at the percentage of people with a bachelor's degree or higher is about 34%, and that stayed pretty consistent over the last 20 years or so. But look at the gap between people with a BA that have no disability and people with a disability, particularly people with cognitive disabilities. So again, you're seeing this divide. So it's sort of like there might be a little difference here, but over time, you see that gap grow and grow and grow. And the other folks, I don't know if folks at all today who maybe work in economics or workforce development, things like this, what do these numbers also say about the prospect for the American workforce, about people having the training and education that we need for this country to be economic drivers and engines? So when we talk about these topics, there's really this sort of individual level or perspective of thinking about people's individual experience, but there's also this perspective of we all do well when we all do well. And so we should care about these things because they help our communities and our societies be successful collectively. The next little data nugget that I want to share with you here is looking at the employment rate. Again, the categories of education down the left-hand side, the disability categories up above. And so if you look at the employment rate for people with a BA or higher, around 80%, any disability versus a cognitive disability, you really do see that people with disabilities are not in the workforce at the same rates that other people are. The other thing that's interesting about this number, and it's also remained pretty consistent over time, is that people who are not employed and looking or not looking for work. So about, again, you see this about 20% of people are looking for work even if they're not employed, but are people with disabilities looking for work? And that's pretty low. And so again, it sort of begs the question of, well, why is that? What is it about our educational settings or employment settings that are not making these spaces available or accessible to people with disabilities? I know the folks here at the Center for Community Inclusion also work with folks at the University of New Hampshire, and these numbers come out of some data that they run every month looking at the employment participation rate and the labor force participation rate and the employment population ratio. And these are also other indicators. I'm sorry they don't pop up a little bit, but basically what we see here is, again, indicators of how much people with disabilities are or are not in the workforce. And really every way that you slice it, people with disabilities are significantly not a part of the American workforce the same way as people without disabilities. So again, it's sort of like, well, why is that? Because we invest a lot of money. We have a lot of policies that support inclusion or prioritize inclusion. So why are we still struggling so much, or why are there such huge gaps? Again, this is the income nugget is what I'm going to share last here, is thinking about the poverty rate. And so for people across the United States, the poverty rate for people without disabilities, again, has also stayed relatively consistent over the course of time. But for people with cognitive disabilities, they're living at or below poverty level at 3 times the rate as other groups of people. And so when you think about that, the poverty rate according to federal poverty guidelines is $12,100 for an individual. For a family of 4, the poverty rate is $25,100. So 30% of people with cognitive disabilities are living at or below the poverty level. So again, when you think about what are the pathways to economic well-being, education, and employment, if they're not pathways for people with disabilities, how do we ever get to a place where we have equity for people with and without disabilities? I also added the annual earnings and the annual household income just to give some context. I was a little bit surprised because I actually thought some of those numbers would be a little bit lower in terms of annual household income. But when you look at some of those numbers, particularly the 36.9 and the 43.3, if that was your annual household income, can you pay your rent? Can you cover your health care costs? Can you afford to go to post-secondary school? Can you afford to go to school? So part of this, again, is that it's all wrapped up together of sort of disability, poverty, employment in this really complicated ball. And what we really see is that the trajectory for people with disabilities is not the same. It is not the equation of, if I go to school, I'll get a job and I'll have economic well-being, because the pathways to education are much more challenging, the pathways to employment. And again, some of these things are social constructs, they are community constructs, they are cultural constructs, but there are things that we can do both at an individual and a community level and an institution level that can start to help move these. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here later on, but it really is trying to illustrate, to say, well, again, it's not as easy to say, well, if people just go to school and get a job, they'll be fine, because that pathway is not necessarily open for everyone. So what we really see then, when you kind of put all of these things, is that disability is both a cause and a consequence of poverty. It's a cause of poverty in the sense of that people with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed, underemployed, have low earnings or no savings, but it's also a consequence of poverty because disability does have more complicated health problems, or limited access to education, housing, or a decreased life expectancy, or increased rates of social, emotional, and financial isolation. And so it really is this sort of vicious cycle of how do you break that? So now we're a small enough group, I feel like I could ask, be like, well, does anyone know the answer of what is the primary pathway out of poverty, and what is the primary pathway to break out of this cycle? It's education and employment. That's the right answer. And so I'm going to go back to this for just a second. And so to think about this is that, where should we be making our investments? In this country, anti-poverty programs really don't consider people with disabilities, and disability services and supports in this country don't lift people out of poverty. So again, you're sort of stuck in this cycle of, what are we going to do? So it's really about, how do we make our workplaces more accessible and accommodating? How do we make our institutions of education more accessible and more welcoming for people with disabilities? But beyond just kind of increasing access, it's also important to remember that the ADA, I mean, there are laws. These are things that we're supposed to already be doing, So when you look at things that are under the ADA or Section 504 of the Rehab Act, I mean, these are things that are supposed to be happening, and that sort of regardless of maybe where you sit in your job, it's sort of all of our responsibilities. But one of the things that we have certainly found, and it sort of bears out in some of the research that we do, is that it's our attitudes and our actions that have some of the greatest impact on some of the numbers that we see here. And so while there really are some of these big systematic barriers, when it comes to sort of our beliefs about disability and expectation, those are the things that we as individuals can work on the most. So we're gonna dig into that a little bit. The other trajectory that I want to talk about, and for people that work in disability services regularly or sort of identify as, service professionals or family members, is that if you ask family members in some of the work that we've done, what do you want your son or daughter to have? And lots of people say, well, I want them to have a job or, have their own home. I want my son or daughter to have friends. I want to have friends. I want to be a part of something bigger. I want to be connected to other people. And this is where it comes into this sort of valued social role or the social currency. And Dr. Dana actually mentioned that when he was sort of talking about that social connectedness that we have. And when we think about life and sort of being human, what are the things that help us develop that social currency, if you will, that valued social role? And what we see is, or what we know to be true, is that people having experiences to try new things, opportunities to take risk, and the dignity to be able to take risks and fail, and opportunities to contribute are all of those ingredients, if you will, that help us all build up that kind of social currency and those valued social roles. And so having a job and having an education, having that economic well-being or success is really important. But having an education, having a job also are connected very deeply and intrinsically with these valued social roles and this social currency. So if we want to be serious about inclusion of people with disabilities, you can't just talk about education and employment. You have to talk about it in the context of the sort of valued social roles in the space that people occupy, to say we are all equals. And in the sense, and until we can address some of those other pieces, it can be really hard. But the reality is that developing that social currency or those valued social roles don't necessarily always come naturally, or the structures that we've built for people with disabilities and their families don't necessarily always facilitate that either. And so really, although we recognize that education and employment are really important pathways, these valued social roles in these shared and cultural spaces that we have can be equally as important. And to be able to build that social currency, people need to be able to have those experiences, take risks, fail, and have opportunities to contribute. So I decided to include this just in the sense of how important I do think that sort of valued social role is. And this is a little bit more academic than I like to necessarily get into, but Wolff-Wolfensberger, has anybody heard of Wolff-Wolfensberger before? Or Burton Irie? So I'm assuming the people from the Center for Community Inclusion have. But they talked about, Wolff-Wolfensberger talked about the social role valorization, and people who have devalued roles or social roles in society, or very few, sort of have marginal value. And what you can't see that's hiding behind the captioning up there is that going to school and having a job are valued social roles. So again, if people with disabilities aren't getting into an employment or aren't getting into education, those are some of the primary pathways that we need in society to get to those valued social roles. And so if people don't have those valued roles, their sort of place in society and community is not seen as valuable. So part of our work about inclusion is also building up the space and the capacity to attend to valued social roles. And to kind of hit that concept home, if you think about how do you define a valued social role, is that many people wear different hats. You might be a professor, a teacher, a mom, a nurse, a volunteer, a coach. Those are all things that sort of have value in our society. And when you think about if it's a valued social role, is that if you did not occupy that space or that role, would you be missed? That's a good way to kind of think about, is something a valued social role? And the question that to ask ourselves about people with disabilities or people that might be receiving services or supports is that, do they have the opportunity to have those valued social roles as well? And historically, again, in our disability service system, we haven't really created the space for those valued social roles to develop. But the good news is that there are things that we can do today, right now, to start picking away at this, or to continue to pick away at this, because there are so many people obviously on this campus and all over in your community of whom this resonates with. And so it's not a matter of like, hey, we're starting something new today. It's about how do we incorporate different attitudes and practices that might help us start to continue to move the needle, even if it's just in our classroom or our community or our campus. And so I have 6 items that we're going to talk about for taking action today. And this is, I'm going to pull in a couple videos here in a few minutes. And these actions really can be done individually, but they can also be done as part of academic units, as part of classrooms, as part of communities, as part of families. And it really is this idea of if our goal is to increase the likelihood or the opportunities for people with disabilities to go to school and to have a job, these are some of the things that we can do if we're willing to commit. Excuse me, I just got to take a drink here. But it's also really important to not forget, even though there's individual action that we can take, that just as Dr. Dana mentioned, is like, we're in this together, like this is our community. And so we can't always say, well, it's somebody else's job to be more inclusive. It's somebody else's job to think about accessibility. There's a unit on campus that's their job. It's not my job. It's all of our jobs and our responsibilities. And really part of our challenges is for far too long, we haven't been willing to sort of hold the mirror up to ourselves and say, what are we committing to and how are we going to do it right now? And how are we going to make inclusion the norm rather than, again, something that's special or different. So the first one is actually really simple, but it's probably one of the hardest ones. And that is committing to full inclusion. So to make education and employment sort of the new normal and the new expectation, that we have to pursue, support, and vigorously defend inclusion for all people. And all means all. I can't tell you how many times when we talk about the research or the work that we do, people will say, well, not my son or daughter, they're too disabled. We're not that group of people, that's employment's not for them. If we are really serious about making an inclusion a reality and our spaces accessible, you've got to think about everybody. People with visible disabilities, people with invisible disabilities. And when we start thinking and talking that way, it's about everybody. It's not about exclusion or sort of segregation. It's not even about integration anymore. It's about people with and without disabilities are existing and sharing spaces everywhere. On college campuses, in the workplace, in the home, in transportation. So again, the CDC defines inclusion of people with disabilities are the everyday activities that remove barriers such as physical, communication, or attitudinal that hamper individuals' ability to have full participation in society. And this is actually really a difficult topic too, because if you think about yourself and your own professional history and your own professional experiences, do you believe all means all? You don't have to answer that now. But do you really yourself in your heart of hearts believe that all people can be included in post-secondary education? That all people with disabilities can have a job? And if you don't, that's okay, because there are lots of people that have those thoughts, but it's how do we start unpacking some of those barriers that we have within ourselves to be like, well, I talk about employment for people with disabilities, all the time, but maybe I don't mean that group. I have to start unpacking my own stereotypes and biases about that to figure out what is that really about. And the other thing that makes inclusion really, really hard sometimes is that the way that our services and our systems are funded in the United States for people with disabilities, particularly significant disabilities, is that we do not prioritize inclusion. That we spend billions of dollars in long-term services and supports and in education for people with disabilities to segregate them. And I will own this as my opinion at the moment. I think it's on the next slide here, is that public money, and I will own this as my own opinion, as not opinion of my university or my coworkers, although some of them do share it. Public money should not be used to segregate people with disabilities. That is a very controversial statement. But when you think about it, if you're really serious about including people with disabilities, you can't have, but not those guys, not that group. And so all has to mean all, because separate is not equal. And if we put in any other group to say, well, kids with glasses have to be in this community, or adults who ascribe to the Jewish faith are in this group, or people who represent this racial category, they get this and not that, we would never be okay with that, and we would never tolerate that. But we have tolerated that for generations of people with disabilities. And so it's the law. People with and without disabilities should be included in everyday society. The Americans with Disabilities Act outlined that. The Affordable Care Act ensures and prioritizes access to health care for that. Section 504 of the Rehab Act prioritizes education and employment. These are all part of, again, our sort of social and policy fabric. And then the Olmsted decision, as decided by the Supreme Court, was that inclusion is an expectation. And I'm going to actually read you the mandate from the court order there from the Olmsted decision, is that Title II of the ADA prohibits unjustified segregation of individuals with disabilities, and that institutional settings perpetuate unwanted assumptions, and confinement severely diminishes everyday life activities. I mean, that's what the Supreme Court said. And so even though these are our laws, sometimes they're really hard to bring into practice, both in our own views and in our community, in our professional views. So I have a couple videos here. Some of them are from self-advocates or family members that I'm going to share about some of these different topics. So again, idea and solution number one is committing to and believing in full inclusion for everyone. So I'm going to have to go back and forth, so I apologize. Just make sure I can do that. So we're going to listen to a gentleman named Bill first. Okay.
School when I was a kid was segregated. When I was younger, I didn't speak much, so my parents didn't know what to do with me. The school system thought, well, he'll grow out of it. And when I was in kindergarten, I told my parents I wanted to stay back. And people ask you, why would you want to stay back in kindergarten? I tell people, free milk and cookies. Where could you get free milk and cookies and take naps? You didn't have to do homework or anything. As I got a little older and got pushed through the system, you can say first grade, I went to first grade 2 times because I couldn't keep up with the regular kids. They told my parents will grow out of it. Went to second grade, had the same issues. They hold you back, but they think you can graduate. When I finally went to 5th grade and they wanted me to get tested, it was 5th or 6th grade, they realized there was something wrong with your son. He could, and they told my parents that he had to see a head shrink. That night when I got home, I thought they were going to shrink my head. I said, oh my goodness, look at my head. I didn't know what a psychologist was. So they labeled me with an intellectual disability, a developmental delays, and I had what they call LD, and that stands for learning disability. School was hard, but then you think things would get better when you're junior high school. No, it got worse. So you still got picked on. People didn't listen to you. You were placed in another school, not of your own choice, of their choice, because special education came along and right to education, but you had no rights. Then when you get in high school, the same old thing happened until I got my own voice, because I didn't talk for the longest time, and people wouldn't believe it today, because I'm really outspoken for what I believe in. And I think kids these days have more opportunities than we had when I was a kid, and we should take advantage of it. Parents should do it. People who is in the system should do it. Support coordinators should help the parents and everything. School when I was a kid.
So that's Bill. And Bill's talking about his experience in the public education system. And that, again, lower expectations, segregation, those were the things that were the norm. But these are in our lifetime, and these things still go on even today. And so it's important, I think, to keep in mind to also not forget about our history and where we've been. Sorry, I'm going to go back to my slides here. Got Bill. So the heading across the top up here now is sort of solution number 2 is this raised expectations. And Bill started to touch on this a little bit in his comments, is that if we are serious about increasing the participation of people with disabilities in education and employment, we have to raise our expectations. That all people have gifts and talents, all people have things to contribute, and do the words that we use every day when we talk to students, when we talk to our families, when we talk to professionals, do those words that we use convey expectation? Do those words convey a positivity? Because the words that we use affect the actions that we take, influence the habits that we develop. And one of the examples that I use when I talk about this, when I talk more exclusively about employment, is that I worked a number of years as a job developer. So my job was supporting people with significant disabilities to enter the workforce. And I used to go in and I used to talk to employers to say, hi, I'm Kelly, I work for Ability Building Center. We help people with significant disabilities find jobs and earn a wage or whatever. Lots of other words in there, but I did not necessarily convey a message of I connect job seekers and employers that are hiring. That's exactly what I was doing, but the message and the words that I used started out from this deficit perspective of like, well, I've got these vulnerable adults and we're trying to get them jobs. Do you want to help us out? Those were the ways that we were sort of trained, but the words that I used affected the actions that I took and the habits that I developed. And so when we think about the training that we have or we have gotten as social workers, as nurses, as special educators, as general educators, do the words that we use convey expectation? And it is one of the most powerful things that we can do to make education and employment a reality, is that Bill sort of said in his comments there that there really weren't any expectations. You got to take naps, have milk and cookies, and things were just going to sort of happen for you, and you didn't really have a lot of choice and control. And this sort of soft bigotry of low expectations really continues to plague us even to this day. And so I really challenge you in the roles that you have, wherever you sit in your university community here or out in the workforce, is do the words that you use communicate expectation and hope as well. So the next video clip here, not quite yet. So the other thing that I wanted to bring in and mention in a couple places is that there is study after study after study of expectations of parents, teachers, social workers, and people with disabilities themselves that predict educational and employment outcomes. So people study this kind of stuff all the time. What helps young kids with disabilities enter the workforce, have a job, get their own home, have a successful life? And what gets measured or what gets captured when they're looking for statistical significance is expectations. And so it's the school teacher's expectation was the only thing that predicted entering competitive employment. Parental expectations mediated any other factors in social and familial backgrounds in terms of had the direct relationship with an employment outcome, or in this case, in this particular study, they were looking at both having a job and living independently. So parent expectations. And time again, an individual's self-fulfilling prophecy of, if you ask people with disabilities, are you going to work? Are you going to have a job? People who said that were more likely to have jobs. Youth with higher parental expectations of self-support had better employment outcomes, and motivation and expectations regarding future work and level of situation predicted findings, as well as maintaining employment for at least 6 months in another study. So when we go back to these words that we use, this is pretty powerful stuff in the sense of that how we talk to our students, how we engage with our coworkers and our colleagues matter a great deal. And it seems really weird because it'd be like, well, if all I have to do is just talk differently, is that going to change stuff? And some of this research, yeah, it will. And it's something that we can do every single day. So now we're going to listen to a video from Ricardo. And I appreciate you guys being patient as I go back and forth. I just wanted to make sure I captured the captions. Here. We'll bring it back.
Life is about moving on, and whatever it is that you can do to achieve, reach it. I really believe that people have goals, and their goals, there's so many goals, so many talents, and sometimes if we could just reach some of the talents and get to a level where they can feel confident in achieving, then that's a beautiful reward. You can see the growth in them. But if we don't give them the opportunity and show them that there's just a wall that sits there and no name, and all you have is a label, it just doesn't work. Get rid of the label and open up new doors. That's how I feel.
I like that Jerry kept that in that one at the end where he gets a little excited there. So you heard Ricardo talk about, again, these expectations that we have of youth and getting rid of the label. Now, the reality is, for those of us, labels do serve a function and a purpose in part of our system as well. And so you're not necessarily going to completely get rid of the labels. But remember, we talked about at the very beginning sort of the spectrum of disability, of visible and invisible disabilities, is that in many cases the labels should be irrelevant. People have gifts and talents and things to contribute. And when we can focus less on the labels and the deficits, that's when we get to see movement and opportunity. So again, you can't see it up there, but solution number 3 is presuming competence. When we are not sure what a student can learn, presume competence and the ability to learn. Now, this actually came from something out of general ed, but it actually very much rings true as well, is that so wherever you sort of sit in your field or your industry, when you are supporting someone with a disability, getting to know someone with a disability, maybe you know what their label is, maybe you don't. Are you starting from a place of competence? Or do you say, well, that person has an intellectual disability and their IQ is 65, so I'm going to make an assumption about their competence or their contribution even before I know anything about them? The reality is, as humans, we do that. We have to challenge ourselves not to do that, and to say that regardless of a label a person may occupy, is that when we start with the presumption of competence, that's when we're able to make movements on things around inclusion. And that rather than assuming that people have deficits and are not able to be successful in the classroom, successful at work, successful wherever, we have to start with that place. So in this particular study, they were looking at educators presuming competence is critical then to accept their students where they're at, to meet students where they're at, and believe that they're able to achieve these things in the classroom, in education, in life. So the next one I have here is of Jonathan, and Jonathan's also going to mention a resource here at the end I'm going to shout out to.
When I was younger, I was never told to think about college. I was too low functioning, but I still wanted to go to college. So I told my family that I wanted to go to college. It wasn't easy, and it took a lot of work. Now I'm a student at Mass Bay Community College. So make your dreams come true, and think college.
For information about college for people with intellectual disabilities, visit thinkcollege.net.
Have folks heard about Think College before? Yes? So that is a resource I have listed at the end for folks, that they have a number of great resources about college services and supports for people with intellectual disabilities. But again, what Jonathan was sort of talking about here was that people didn't assume that he could go to college even though he wanted to, and people didn't talk about it. It was something he still wanted to do. And it was still a lot of work, but it's still a possibility. Solution number 4, or concept number 4 in terms about increasing access to education and employment, is this notion of the power of experiences. When I showed you that kind of longer equation at the beginning of like opportunity to contribute, dignity of risk, experiences to try new things, sort of develop that value, that social currency, if you will, is that we as human beings need experiences, willingness to try, opportunities to take risks, a little bit of failure, and develop some self-awareness, and those experiences are really, really powerful. And historically, we haven't always offered the same experiences to people with disabilities in education and employment. But when we do offer those experiences, or do make those experiences happen, or prioritize those experiences, we get a lot better educational and employment outcomes. So a couple studies here, again, there is study after study about work experience and paid employment have been identified as highly associated with post-school employment outcomes. And that paid work experience in adolescent is identified as a prominent predictor of better post-school outcomes. Do kids go on to post-secondary education? Do they have a job? Do they live independently? So all of these experiences that we can support younger students having have a benefit in life, but the reality is the benefit of those experiences doesn't stop when you sort of leave that transition window. This is true for all students in your college and university communities, is that having experiences and offering experiences in the classroom with their peers, with the university community, has a positive impact. So I'm going to bring up one more video here.
I have pretty high expectations for myself, and then there's always the expectations of the professors, and it's the blend between the two that's most important. I've always found a way to do well or do my best in all of my courses, no matter what.
I do know that she belongs in this classroom because she has a lot to offer, and she thinks about the works that we're discussing, and the class accepts her on that level completely.
So that was an important one too, because I think they did a good job in that clip in talking about the benefits of college, why college is awesome, what people get out of college, but then saying, well, who should go to college? And when you actually stop and be like, well, should people with intellectual disabilities go to college, or should that be open? People have a very different response to that. And so we do have to really continue to work hard to be able to sort of bridge that gap to say, if somebody wants to go to college, are our spaces of higher education open and accessible and available? What are we doing as instructors, as professionals, as fellow students to make that possibility happen? The next solution that I want to present or get people to just think about in your everyday practice, in your everyday life, is this idea of universal design for learning. And actually I'm going to skip to the next slide here because it shows it a little bit better, is that we've really been taught about including people with disabilities is that we're at the sort of level 4, that there's some kind of special accommodations that people need, that it takes a lot of money and a lot of effort. But really where we're trying to move to is, how do we make classroom spaces universal so everyone benefits from the different styles of learning that students have, the different types of assignments that measure knowledge, skills, and abilities? How do we do that so the maximum number of people benefit, not just a couple people in certain particular categories? And there's actually a really good video about explaining how universal design works that I want to share with you. But it's one of those things that we can do in our everyday practices and our everyday jobs to make educational employment spaces more accessible. I mean, I do apologize for switching the flow out here and having to go back and forth. I just really want to make sure that those captions are there. But this video does a really great job of thinking about why universal design for learning matters.
Imagine you went into a big clothes store, and all that was in sale was one type of outfit, in one size, with no thought given to different individual body shapes or personalities. That would be crazy, right? Expecting everyone to be able to fit into the same size and express themselves in the same colour and style? Yet in many cases, that's exactly what is happening in our education system. When it comes to learning, variability is the rule, not the exception, and our college campuses are now grappling with the demands of an increasingly diverse cohort of learners, with increasing numbers of international students, students from different cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, mature students, and students with disabilities. Despite this, curriculums are still designed for the mythical average learner, and all are expected to engage and learn on the same terms. Not enough flexibility is built in at the design stage to give all students equal opportunities to learn in ways that plays in their own strengths. So, how can our institutions respond to these challenges? Enter Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. UDL is an educational framework that guides the design of learning goals, materials, methods and assessments, as well as the policies surrounding these curricular elements with the diversity of learners in mind. The framework was developed by US organisation CAST and is based on research in the field of neuroscience. It promotes 3 core principles for educators to build into their teaching practice, calling on them to provide students with multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. The framework includes a set of guidelines on how you can turn these principles into practice. For example, by fostering collaboration with the introduction of group work with clear goals, roles, and responsibilities. By using different types of media to support learning and ensuring that all materials are accessible. And by providing a choice of assessment instruments while maintaining robust learning outcomes. You are probably already including some UDL elements in your practice without realising it, and there's much more to explore. So don't be afraid to let Universal Design for Learning give you a new lens through which to look at your teaching and learning practice and help you to better reach all of your students. For more information and resources,
So how many of you, or how often do you guys get to talk about Universal Design for Learning on campus? Is that something that's part of accessibility? People have heard that term before. One of the great things about UDL, and one of, I think, sort of the accessory benefits for people with disabilities is UDL is thinking about all groups of people. Remember that sort of all means all of diverse learners, mature learners, international students, people from different socio and cultural economic backgrounds. And so that's the really powerful thing about when we commit to universal design for learning in our classroom spaces or in our workspaces, that we really have this opportunity to reach more people. But the reality is that if you think about your training as an educator or social worker or nurse or wherever, again, you sort of occupy, is that we haven't been trained that way. That isn't really how our brains have been professionally trained to think of that. Like, well, no, we have to make one accommodation for students with disabilities rather than taking a further step back to say, how do we think about how we teach and how we support employees in a way that benefits a variety of group of people? And it really, again, it is really an exercise in sort of your brain as well as your own commitment to committing to saying, I want to think about accommodation differently and take a step further back and say, how do I create something that's more universal? And so the last sort of solution that I want to put in front of folks is this notion of starting early. So we kind of talked about committing to inclusion, raising our expectations, making sure that we provide diverse experiences. And this last one is really about starting learning that little kids, need a strong foundation to succeed in school. And most of these early experiences that children have develop that foundational knowledge. And when we go and talk about community living for adults and the research that we do, so many times we get poo-pooed by early childhood professionals or in-home family visitors to be like, that community living stuff, getting a job, living on your own, having a savings account, like they're going to worry about that down the road. Like when they get to be adults, adult services people handle that. But so much of the foundations for community living come from good social emotional development. So are there early educators in the room? I know Alan, that's some of your background as well too. Or people that have that as part of their job and their careers, is that really these ingredients of supporting children to develop interactions with their peers, being able to express their emotion, being able to manage and understand empathy and sort of emotional regulation and impulse control. And so if we are also serious about increasing education employment for people with disabilities, we have to attend to, it's not just something that happens in adulthood. It's not just something that happens when a student or a person turns 16 when they're in high school. Be like, let's talk about getting a job or going to college now. There are skills and foundational things that need to be invested in early on. And so this this is just a list of 5 reasons that we came up with about why investing in early childhood and supporting families matters so much. And that's really because this social and emotional competencies is tied to academic achievement. So the more we support kids when they're younger, the easier it is for them when they get older. And the social emotional skills matter in the workplace. So if we're talking about people with disabilities and being included in the workforce, which they should be and can be, is that the foundation of those skills that we build when kids are little really have an impact and an influence. It's also really important to invest in this because what we know through research is that low-income and minority students disproportionately have different or lack social or emotional skills. So we do have to spend time and energy and resource in investing in that to basically create that equal and that level playing field. And that there also is study after study of these social emotional learning programs that really work in terms of this return on investment, of that when we invest in things like Head Start that have wraparound supports for young people and supports for families, that they really benefit not only the individual family, but they benefit society and community. And that was kind of the economic sense piece. So the last video clip that I'm going to share with you here, we're just about ready to wrap up, and I'm not going to show the whole thing, but it's really about this notion of supporting risk and investing in kind of that family component and thinking about what we have to and can get comfortable with, again, to support people with disabilities to fully participate in both education and employment. So the last time I'm going to jump out here.
Parents are scared to let a lot of parents are scared to let their children go because they're scared they're going to fail. But the only way we learn in life is to go out and try. If we fail, that's how we learn. So we try to get the parents to understand that they're not going to be around always. You have to learn to let your child go. If they're 25, 30 years old, they're no longer a child. No matter what their disability is, everybody has a talent, everybody has a gift. Everybody can live on their own and do things on their own with the right supports around them.
People often look at how much work this takes, and they know that my husband and I put so much into it, and they say, but are you facing reality? If Steve will always need support, you won't always be around to be able to provide that support. So what are you going to do then? And we look at each other and we say, so Steve, who is now almost 30, was only 26 when we helped him to move out of the home and into this alternative, which means that he's not only had these 4 years, but he anticipates that we'll be around for quite a while and he'll have a lot more years. Could we do what people suggest and say, well, since you don't know what will be when you're old and you're not here anymore, to condemn him to living in a life that was a very restricted life in a group home, because someday there will be a challenge as to what will happen. We, as a family, have tried to put a lot of planning into place as to how there will be supports to pick up when we're not able to do it. But we can't let that fear for the far future influence what opportunities we're going to give Steve now when he's 26 and when he's 30 and 35.
So I think that kind of ties into both the first speaker and the second speaker about supporting kids and families, but at the same time also not being driven by fear. And we were talking again about that dignity to take a risk a little bit earlier. But we really need to also think about how do we meaningfully engage and connect to families and hear and listen to what their concerns or fears or challenges are as well. So we're just about finished here. I want to just quickly review the sort of 6 takeaway messages are. If our goal is we want to increase the number of people with disabilities who are in education and who are fully participating in the workforce, what are some of those things that we can do? And the first takeaway is that all means all, because full inclusion is for everyone. We have to commit to all means all. And that is a heavy lift for a lot of individuals. It's a heavy lift for a lot of systems. The second takeaway is that to think about the words that we use matter, that there is power in a good way, in the language of expectations? Are the words that we're using when we interact with our friends, our colleagues, our family members, people with disabilities, are we conveying expectation? Number 3 being that people with disabilities can be successful in post-secondary education, employment, and that starting from a place of competence first. Again, it's not always how we were trained to think, but if this is the starting point that we have, these are ways that we can continue to hopefully improve the rates of people with disabilities entering post-secondary ed and jobs. Takeaway number 4 is that experiences in taking risks and having opportunities to try lead to the development of that social currency. Because again, are we not only trying to get to economic well-being through education, employment, but we're also trying to get to that valued social role. Takeaway number 5 is moving beyond just the accommodation thinking and really committing to and believing in the importance of universal design for learning, about creating those spaces that work for multiple groups of people. And last but not least, investing in that social emotional development of young children and family support have significant returns on investment, and starting early really matters a great deal. So I do have a list of references and resources for folks. I know that you guys can also find my contact information probably on the program today. We have, I think, a few minutes for questions, but I really appreciate your time and your interest in the topic today. I know there's some other great sessions today to listen to and to learn from people, but I hopefully set the stage for you today and gave you some hope, some ideas, some excitement, and some interest about how do we really and meaningfully include people with disabilities and increase their participation both in education and employment.